Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. Ben is the founder of FDAImports.com and a former FDA regulatory counsel, who helps companies worldwide navigate the complex intersection of FDA oversight and international trade. I'm Sean O'Connor. And today we're talking about something that's literally, if you're in this business, it's on everybody's lips, and that's tariffs. Ben, how are you doing?
Oh, great. Thanks, Sean. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. I'm honestly, I'm not reading Bloomberg every day. I don't have a Bloomberg terminal on my desk, but I know there was I saw a story specifically about this, and there's something about a ton of lawsuits having surfaced over the weekend. And I'm thinking there was a key date. I mean, today, as we speak, it's the 19th, right? And so was it 30 days ago? I mean, there's just deadlines involved here, right, that are triggering things. Let's get into that a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. So everybody should recall that on February 20th, the Supreme Court found the IEEPA tariffs. These are the tariffs that Donald Trump put into place in early April of 2025 that basically affected every single country. And these were the fentanyl tariffs. You heard talk about fentanyl, that Mexico and Canada and China are not doing enough to keep fentanyl. Those were IEEPA tariffs. They were tariffs that were imposed based upon the purported authority that the president had under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. And so that went all the way to the Supreme Court. February 20th, right. Donald Trump's, the administration lost. In the meantime, 330,000.
Hold it right there. So,
sure.
So the Supreme Court basically ruled that it was an unconstitutional action, so to speak?
Right. Yeah, that's right. And most people, when you think of unconstitutional, they think of things like, right of free speech, or they think of right of religion, or they think of, of racial related, rights.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And so, but constitutionality is any legal issue that has to do with whether or not an action is supported or permitted by the Constitution. And in this case, the Supreme Court found that the executive branch, and of course the president is the head of the executive branch, did not have the power under IEEPA in order to administer these tariffs. However, interestingly enough, in some of the opinions, particularly those opinions that were dissenting, they pointed out that the president could have done it other ways. And so there's some people who said, well, maybe he could have won. Well, let's put that aside. It's unconstitutional because the Supreme Court ruled by majority that Congress has the authority to establish tariffs, not the president, and that they found that the president, in fact, established a tariff. And did so under IEEPA, and IEEPA itself doesn't give the president that power, and that's why it's a constitutional case, and that's what was struck down on February the 20th. Interestingly, up until then, and this litigation has been going on since they were initiated in the beginning of in April of last year. Mm-hmm. No court, even though the administration had lost in many, many, many different courts, no court had told Customs, CBP, to actually give the money back, and even the Supreme Court didn't do that, right? And largely because it wasn't really in front of the Supreme Court. So it makes its way back down, right? The Supreme Court drops it down to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. The CAFC drops it down to the Court of International Trade. That's where these cases started, in the CIT. And so these cases now are back down in the trial court. And no one is there's a couple of different ways that people might be able to get these tariffs back, and it's not really clear how these refunds are going to work. And so there is a deadline. There's some deadlines that could exist and could be meaningful. Well, there's some dates that could be deadlines. An example is February 20th is the ruling in the Supreme Court. A ruling becomes final 25 days after the losing party has their opportunity to ask for a rehearing has expired, and it expires 25 days later. That was March 17th. Okay. So today's the 19th. 2 days ago was March 17th, and that was the time when the president's opportunity to request a rehearing of the Supreme Court expired. And so the argument is, once that happened, then that deadline has passed. Then the original jurisdiction, the way the Court of International Trade originally got these cases, expired with it. And now they're might have expired with it, right? Now it might be that you get into court a different way, or you have to get the tariffs a different way, which don't involve court. It involves, there's a whole administrative process with customs. Big difference, right? So there's a big question as to whether or not it was going to matter. And so what happened was a lot of companies, including a lot of my clients, made the determination that it was riskier not to sue when it really wasn't that expensive to file a Me Too lawsuit. Like you're not starting all the arguments over again. You're just tacking on to the arguments that were heard in the Supreme Court and saying, yeah, me too. And that's a pretty cheap lawsuit to file compared to like initiating the whole thing. And and so it's not that expensive. That's really what you put at risk is the money to file the lawsuit. Because if it turns out you didn't have to file the lawsuit, you're out the legal fees, but that's about it. If it turns out you did have to, but you didn't file, right? Now it's a different answer, and nobody really knows what that would look like. So a lot of people, a lot of companies sued over the weekend. We filed lots of lawsuits.
Sort of a just in case.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a Me Too suit. It's basically saying, we're just like them, the ones who won the Supreme Court, and you should treat us like them. Now, I've talked about consolidation, that the Court of International Trade doesn't want to hear 330,000 lawsuits, when that's how many importers would arguably be subject to refunds. And so my expectation is the court is going to roll these cases up. And so I see really the March 17 deadline more about consolidation. I could see them saying, if you didn't get in by then you got to wait for the next consolidation. Now, people are still suing. I have clients that are still suing, even though March 17 is passed. Now the question is going to become, which jurisdiction. There's a couple of jurisdictions that the CIT could get these cases in, and so those things are still going to be ironed out.
I mean, we're talking about a ton of dough, obviously, right? Tariffs were paid, but there really is no, if I'm understanding you right, and from our previous conversation, there really is no mechanism in place by which refunds are allocated, or you know what I mean? Like, how do I claim that? It's not like the IRS where there's a system in place already.
Well, so there is a system in place. In fact, Customs has something called the Automated Commercial Environment, or ACE, ACE. And they do give refunds to duty, and for a number of different reasons. I mean, I'll give you one example, something that's called drawback, where I import some goods and they're subject to duty and I pay the duty. Then I use those goods and they manufacture certain things, and then they get exported back out. Now, even though I might have been able to bring them in duty free and then export them, and never have paid duty, a lot of times instead, when I do the export, after those entries do what's called liquidation, and that's like the final tying of the bow of the case related, the finances related to that transaction, that entry transaction. As soon as it liquidates, then I can get my money back, and I get that as a refund in a drawback, right? So that exists. The problem is, and I could protest, like before, I could protest customs if I think I paid too much duty because I used the wrong classification and it was a mistake or whatever. And I come to customs and I say, I can go to customs and I can protest their liquidation of the entry at the wrong classification with the wrong classification number, causing me to pay more duty. And when that happens, I can protest. There's a whole process for protest. It's administrative. But at the end of it, if I win, then I get my refund in ACE. I get it through that system. And now, but there is not for this, right? This is the different, right? So it's unclear, and partly it's because it's unclear whether or not this situation, right, the facts of these cases are protestable. Can you protest them under the rules? If they're not protestable, then you can't use the regular administrative process. And it turns out that these cases were brought into the Court of International Trade by a jurisdictional method that has nothing to do with protests. And the arguments were that these are not protestable, and the Court of International Trade actually said that in one of these cases. Now, that was never actually appealed. That question was not appealed. The Supreme Court sort of took it as given that these cases are not protestable. And if that's true, then there probably is no deadline. But I expect the customs and the government is going to say, no. We can appeal that. We have plenty of time to appeal that. But what did customs do? Customs is playing nice right now, and I don't trust them. All right. Here's what they're doing, right? They basically have gone to the court and they've said, look, it's 330,000 importers. We know you don't want a bunch of these cases. I know you want us, the court told Customs, pay the money back immediately. Well, Customs was like, how am I going to do that? Right? Pay them back immediately. Right. And so what did they do? They came in and they said, wait, we have a proposal. We're going to use ACE. And we're going to create a system in ACE, a little sort of module in ACE. And that's going to be our mechanism for getting the details about your shipments that you believe are entitled to a refund for us to evaluate and to see whether you're right. And if you're right, then you'll get your refunds in ACE, but not through the ordinary protest routes or the drawbacks. It's going to be, but in the same system. Sounds brilliant, right? And they said, Customs says it'll take 45 days for us to build this thing. Well, first of all, I used to work for the government, right? And I worked for the Food and Drug Administration. I did a lot of work with Customs. And when I was with FDA, I did a lot of work with Customs, including working with them on the creation of electronic systems and data systems for handling imports. I mean, FDA has systems too. Well, they have to interface with Customs. So I've been in this world of creating electronic systems for managing import issues. And I'm going to tell you something, nothing takes 45 days, right? That's a pipe dream, right? So my opinion, that's them stalling, right, and buying a little bit of time and getting everybody to say, maybe we don't sue. I had a lot of people say, yeah, I don't think we're going to sue because Customs says they're going to let me just do it through the regular system, through ACE. I've had Customs brokers say that because Customs brokers very often
they're like taking a wait and see.
Well, and the brokers will a lot of times be the ones that do these protests and they charge for it, and good for them, right? But it's kind of expensive for me to do it, but they can't sue because they're not lawyers. So there's a lot of talk about what matters, and all of this plays into whether March 17th was really a deadline. It turns out that when you look at the rules, 25 days after hearing, that's when the losing party loses its opportunity to request well, it's not an appeal, but to request a rehearing from the Supreme Court. Right. But then like a week later, that's when the case becomes final. So there's actually the deadline of maybe 32 days. Well, that would be March 25th, which is next week. Nobody knows the answer, right? That's part of the problem here. And I think Customs, the ruling that the judge gave Customs saying, send that money back and do it immediately. The judge, by the way, pulled back the immediately part because he understood it would take 45 days to create a system and they're playing nice, right? I just think they're just writing their appeal because they have 60 days to appeal that decision. Right, and I think they filed that appeal on day 44, and of the CIT ruling, and then that just sets off the whole appeal process. It goes up to the Court of Appeals. Of course, they has to be reviewed, and then has to go back to the Supreme Court, and has to come all the way back down again. That's what I think is going to happen, and consequently, my sense is that in the meantime, I've got clients who have to decide, should I sue? And my feeling is that if you're going to sue, it's partly because you want to just make sure you've covered yourself. It's a conservative approach. But you also want to try to get in the first consolidation to the extent that there are more than one consolidations. And 330 people haven't sued so far, right? And there was a surge. That's what there was a Bloomberg article about that.
That was that article. About.
Yeah, and a bunch of them were my clients. I mean, not all of them, obviously, but there was a lot of lawsuits that were filed. So that's what's sort of going on in that import world. And if you haven't had somebody tell you this, and you're in the import world and you paid IEEPA duties, you ought to DM me, right? Because we can figure out what you ought to be doing, and then you make your own decisions. But it's definitely worth doing the analysis, not necessarily just believing what everybody tells you, because people tell you things that are designed sometimes can be designed to benefit them. As attorneys, we're not like that, right? Attorneys, we never do that, right? No, attorneys, right? Our interest is our client's interest, and of course we charge for for giving our advice, but that's different.
No, understood. And there are some scenarios where nobody knows anything, and for sure, and that's kind of, it sounds like where we are at the moment in this like limbo space. And so next week, what do you think? You think there'll be some news trickling out, so to speak, or you think it'll be kind of quiet and then on that date, some kind of an announcement will get made?
Well, so the government has certain obligations. First of all, you got all these lawsuits that were filed, and these are filed in the form of a complaint. Just like any other person sues anybody, or you sue the government, or the government sues you, there's a complaint that's filed. And what happens next is you have a right to answer the complaint or file a motion to dismiss it or whatever. So there's procedure.
And there's a deadline for that.
There's a deadline for that, and it's not the same deadline, right? And so the problem is March 25th is going to come around and there will not have been an answer, right? So we don't know the answer still.
Yeah.
That means there's going to continue to be lawsuits coming in, which means there's going to be multiple tranches, right? I think that you're going to have multiple consolidations that are going to be occurring. The other thing is, if it was easy, it wouldn't have gone to the Supreme Court. Okay. Right. I mean, now some people say, oh, of course he was going to lose that case. Well, no, that's a lot of people. There are a lot of people who disagree with that argument, right? Just say that, no, there's an argument that he actually had the authority and that the Supreme Court's wrong. If it was easy, it wouldn't have gone to the Supreme Court. It wouldn't be in court. And consequently, it's not surprising that we don't actually know the answer, even though I know a lot of the arguments. I understand the arguments, and but I'm inclined to think that that the court is not going to lose the jurisdiction that it's called residual jurisdiction. It's the jurisdiction the Court of International Trade has when it has to do with anything related to tariffs that's not otherwise covered by another way to get to court. And so protests are another way to get to court if it's about refund and tariffs. And so that's why it's important that the Court of International Trade said these are not protestable. If they're not protestable, then you can't use that way to get into court. Well, if you can't use that way, how can it be possible that the residual jurisdiction fails all of a sudden on March the 17th? There'd be no way to get there. Unless, I guess, you followed a protest when the court said it's not protestable. And that hasn't been appealed either, right? So this is not finished. Everybody has to make up their own mind. These Me Too lawsuits, I think, are important for many, many clients and many companies, and others are making other decisions, and that's theirs to make. I actually think that in all circumstances, it's going to come down to Customs is going to have to pay these refunds. That's what I believe is going to happen. But how soon or how long before it happens, or it happens to you versus somebody else, those are a lot of the questions now. And I'd want to be in the first tranche of these consolidated cases, so that when they make the decision that was the decision about the original parties, I get rolled into that one because that's the first one that's going to be made. Yeah.
Wow. Didn't expect a cliffhanger episode.
Yeah, I know. It's funny,
but
it's
that's where we are. To be continued in terms of what unfolds over the next week or more with this tariff issue. Great to talk to you, Ben.
Likewise. Good to see you.
You bet. That's it. That's all the time we have for FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. Ben is the founder of FDAImports.com and former FDA regulatory counsel. He's got a ton of experience helping companies navigate the complex intersection of, FDA oversight and international trade. And as you know, the tariffs are a hot issue right now. If you've and your company are involved in some tariff disputes right now, or you want to get Ben's input, visit their website and reach out to Ben and his team. I'm Sean O'Connor. Be sure to leave a review, forward this to a colleague, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.